I'm going to be talking about Dorothy L. Sayers' work as an anthologist. And between the late 1920s and the mid 1930s, she edited 5 anthologies of short detective fiction. And these are they. So the first 3 appeared with Victor Gollancz. The 4th one there, Tales of Detection, that was published in the Dent Everyman's Library series. And this final collection, Detective Cavalcade, I'm stretching the definition really of an anthology by including this one here, because this was a series of stories that appeared in the Evening Standard newspaper. They were never, as far as I've been able to establish, published in book form. But what I'm going to be doing is talking about really the process by which Sayers put these collections together. And from that perspective, Detective Cavalcade worked pretty much like the anthologies that were published in book form. So that's really what I'm going to be doing. I'm going to be talking about the different competing tensions that Sayers had to deal with when she was putting these collections together. I'm going to talk about the Gollancz volumes first of all. I'll then move on to say something about the other 2 collections. And then towards the end, I'm going to just give a little taste of the kinds of material she was actually including in these volumes and see what we might be able to draw from that. So it was the publisher Victor Gollancz who actually approached Sayers with the project of editing that first volume, Great Short Stories of Detection, Mystery and Horror. They had a prior working relationship. He had recently left the firm of Ernest Benn and set up his own publisher. And Sayers was published by Benn and would have had some dealings with Gollancz while he was there. And Gollancz would also have known that Sayers' contract with Benn only covered novels, so she would be able to do this project for him, for a rival publisher, essentially. And actually, during the time when she was working on these 3 volumes for Gollancz, as they eventually became, she also edited a collection of Lord Peter Wimsey's short stories, which were published as Lord Peter Views the Body, 1928, by Gollancz. And then when her contract with Benn expired in 1930, she moved across to Gollancz for her novels as well. So this is a working relationship that has already been established, and this is sort of the next stage in it, if you like, for Sayers to do this editing project. Just a little bit about where Sayers was at in her career at this point. She published her first novel in 1923, and she was still in 1927 when Gollancz approached her about this anthology. She was still working full-time as a copywriter at S.H. Benson's advertising agency. And it was only in 1929 that she left Benson's in order to take up writing full-time. And by 1934, when the 3rd of these volumes appeared, she was partway through a 2-year stint as the detective fiction reviewer for the Sunday Times. And I think there are some similarities in how she approached that task when we look at how she went about editing these anthologies. She very much takes a kind of systematizing, organizing approach to that. I mean, we would generally expect, I suppose, a reviewer of detective fiction to guide potential readers to compare the books that they're reviewing with others that readers might have encountered. But she seems to be particularly interested in doing this and in almost using those reviews to give a sense of the different directions that the form is developing in at that point in time, just as she does with these anthologies. I have written a little bit about those reviews elsewhere, and they're now also available in book form. They were published in book form a couple of years ago, and they're quite interesting to read. So in his approach to Sayers about doing this first anthology, it was Gollancz who actually suggested that it should be detection, mystery and horror that were covered. Now, as we'll see, Sayers' main interest really, as you might expect, lay with detection. And I suppose just as an aside, really, she seems to have been a bit unsure as to what really she should do with this mystery category. Mystery is an interesting word for Gollancz to have chosen to include, really. I think in an American context, mystery tends to be synonymous almost with detective story or crime story. I would say that from a British perspective, we perhaps would be more likely to connect it to supernatural stories or indeed horror stories. And interestingly, in each of the three Gollancz volumes, Sayers divides them into two, and she calls the first section detection and mystery, and the second section mystery and horror. So she almost identifies mystery as an intermediate form between the other two. I don't have time here to explore the implications of that any further, but I suppose in my mind somewhere is the work that critics, including Christopher Pittard and Maurizio Ascari, have done, thinking about the ways that authors and critics, some authors and critics, tried to exclude the supernatural from the detective form in the late 19th and into the early 20th century. So yeah, it's interesting that she's stuck with that word, really, because it's Gollancz's suggestion, and she clearly wants to, you know, stay in with Gollancz and maybe not challenge him too much, but she's not quite sure what she should do with that category. One issue that we also just need to be aware of is that she's not doing this, she's doing this project not just in the context of developments in detective fiction at the time, but also the wider picture of the market and readership for the short story more generally. And in the introduction to the second volume, she has this to say about short story writing. She says, the very great labour involved in getting a bright, novel and agreeable murder, inventing a suitable detective, dragging in the human interest, and then compressing the thing into 6,000 words is scarcely worthwhile. After an amount of brain exhaustion, which would almost suffice to produce a full-length novel, the net result usually is that the writer feels himself to have merely wasted a perfectly good plot. So slightly exasperated, or feels that, you know, writing short stories aren't really worth the candle. She does cite the success of the first Gollancz volume as an indication that readers, quote, do like this sort of thing. But she's nevertheless suggesting that you know, a combination of the technical difficulties, but also perhaps the poor economic rewards, might actually present real challenges for authors who are working in this form. As you may be aware, Sayers' own short stories tend to progress towards a greater interest in psychology, but it's interesting that even the anthologies she edits that have more of a focus on more recent examples include stories that take a whole range of approaches. I suppose she's acknowledging when she does that, that the conventions that were established in the late Victorian and into the Edwardian period, so even things like in the private investigator, for instance, they're still being used right into the 20th century. And there's also a sense, I suppose, that she includes stories that might not be necessarily to her own taste, but are in themselves good examples of a particular approach, a particular form. So as an anthologist, she's having to balance her own preferences against trying to give a sense of the wider picture, if you like. Now, Sayers' correspondence with Gollancz gives a bit of a glimpse of how she actually went about compiling this first volume. So just a few days after receiving and accepting his suggestion, she writes to him and says, 20 volumes of the Strand magazine have now arrived, and we're having to build a new set of bookshelves. In a day or two, I hope to be able to put forward a more detailed list of suggested stories and some suggestions for arrangement. I don't know whether quite to keep the detective yarns and horoscopes, her own coinage, separate, or mix them up to arrange the authors chronologically or alphabetically, or what. Again, just as an aside, and another bit of context that I don't really have time to explore here, another way of thinking about these anthologies would be within the wider context of anthology making in the 1920s. And I'd just mention, for instance, Patrick Collier's work in his book Modern Print Artifacts. He looks at poetry anthologies, and he talks about the difference it makes if you organize your anthology just alphabetically by author, as opposed to organizing it, say, by themes or chronologically. The main difference, I suppose, apart from the difference in form between poetry and the short story, is that poetry anthologies are much more likely to be used in an educational context. And I suppose if Sayers' anthologies are educational at all, it's in a much more informal way. I think she probably did think of herself as educating the reader to an extent. Now, it's evident that as well as going and reading through back issues of the Strand magazine, Sayers was also trying to track down stories that she remembered reading over the years and that she thought she'd like to include. So she talks in another letter about going on Saturday morning when she wasn't at work to the British Library to try to track stories down. And her eventual categorization of the stories, which I'll show you in a minute, how she actually subdivided that first volume up, that seems to have still been to have been sketched out while she was still trying to identify stories to include. So in January 1928, she sent Gollancz a draft contents list, and she told him, I'm quoting here, "I have also a list of about 40 authors for section 2, which is the mystery and horror section. And in addition, a number which I haven't yet classified." And that's interesting because it seems like she might be trying to decide whether they're detection and mystery or mystery and horror. She's still making decisions at that level. She suggested omitting foreign authors completely for reasons of space. And then she went on, "I haven't got a great number of unknown gems. When you come to look into it, the best stories, as a rule, seem to be written by the best writers. It is curious how often a tale that stood out and impressed my youthful mind turned out, when investigated, to have a famous name attached to it. Either my untrained taste was surprisingly good, or else success actually is the reward for merit." So it seems as though she was working in two directions at the same time. She was tracking down stories, identifying them, and creating subcategories within which to include them. But then she was also trying to classify stories that she also knew about. In relation to this comment about unknown gems, it's worth knowing that the majority of stories in this first anthology, about 2/3 of them, had previously appeared in single authored collections. And this is the highest proportion for any of Sayers' anthologies. I should say that when I'm giving these proportions and numbers and so on, I'm actually following Sayers in just focusing on the detection side of the contents. Later volumes included a greater number of stories that had been retrieved from magazines, and only in that final collection, Detective Cavalcade, did she actually commission stories for inclusion. And I think that perhaps points to the status that she had in the detective fiction community by that point in time, that she was in a position to actually commission people. Now, although in an early letter to Gollancz, Sayers tells him that she thinks that they ought to be focusing more on detective fiction because detective fiction has scarcely been touched when it comes to anthologies. She did have at least one example, or one precedent, I suppose, and this was the Oxford World's Classics collection, Stories of Crime and Detection from 1926, which was edited by E.M. Wrong. Now, the critic Lisa Jaillon has described this series as having an emphasis on education and social aspiration, and it might therefore seem a little bit surprising for detective fiction to make an appearance in it. But Nicholas Murray, who's looked a little bit at the history of this series, he points out that Humphrey Milford, who was one of the editors at this period, was a fan of detective fiction. So that could actually explain why we have an Oxford World's Classics detective fiction anthology. Wrong wasn't a detective fiction author, as far as I'm aware. He was a historian at Magdalen College, Oxford, and his other publications included works on colonial history. He was actually Canadian by birth. And he chose, actually, I hope you can just about see on the slide here, he chose a number of authors who would also appear in Sayers' later anthologies, some prominent names of Edwardian and late Victorian detective fiction. So you might just be able to see we've got 2 stories by Poe, a Conan Doyle story, Arthur Morrison, 2 by R. Austin Freeman, Ernst Brahmer, Chesterton, H.C. Bailey, and they're all within this section, crime and detection. Then we've got crime without detection, E.W. Horning's story there, a Raffles story, and then finally detection without crime, these 2 stories by Barry Payne, which, as the title of that section suggests, what appear at first to be crimes turn out just to be unusual, strange incidents that have happened. So I think it's not unlikely that Sayers might have borrowed from Wrong this idea of subdividing the contents in the way that he does here. But a key difference between this volume of Wrongs and Sayers was the length. So again, you might just be able to see that this volume was about 400 pages long. Each of the 3 anthologies that Sayers edited for Gollancz was about 1,500 pages long, so very substantial, even if you think that only half of it is actually detective stories. So here's the page 1 of the contents of the first series. And you can see here, she's got a little bit of older material, some extracts from the Bible. She's got a couple of classical stories. And then she goes into what she calls the modern detective story. And this is where we get subdivisions. So, and she's just describing them partly by genre and partly by the kinds of detective that appears in them. She goes back into the Victorian period, as you can see here, with Mrs. Henry Wood. We also get Poe, and then again, you can see here she's dividing them up according to the type of detective. So what we can see there, and what we also see in the introduction to this volume, is that she's combining an interest in the history of the form, so wanting to trace the genealogy of the form, with wanting to give a sense of what is actually going on with the form at the time that she's putting the anthology together. Now, you might be aware that the introduction to this volume has itself also been anthologized, initially in Howard Haycroft's very influential 1946 volume, The Art of the Mystery Story, where it appears under the title The Omnibus of Crime, which was the name that this book was given for the American market. The Omnibus of Crime, there are 1 or 2 differences in the content. I think for copyright reasons, they had to make some substitutions. And when Haycroft includes her introduction in his collection of essays on detective fiction, he includes the first 44 pages, which are all about detective fiction and the history of the form, which, as I say, you may be familiar with, and he omits the section on horror stories, and that is, I think it's about 1.5 pages of attention that she gives to horror stories. So that really indicates where her interest lay. Haycroft just misses that off. So having gone quite far back into the history of the form in this first volume, in the second volume, Sayers does shift her attention to slightly more recent work. And again, with the third volume, as I've noted, published in 1934, that drew most heavily on stories that had only previously appeared in periodicals. And in those subsequent 2 volumes, which Gollancz asked her to do because of the success of this first volume, she abandons these more complex subdivisions, and she just divides the contents into, oh, sorry. into two parts. So that's mystery and horror. That's the detection and mystery section. You can see there's no subdivisions here at all, and we're just going alphabetically by author. The green ink is the previous owner's annotations, I should say. And again, you know, the third series, very similar alphabetical run of stories, and the same in the second half. As well as indicating a shift in editorial approach over the course of the 3 volumes, this shift to publishing more recent stories, it's also worth considering the effect that the changes in the actual process of editing might have had on the contents. So although for volumes 2 and 3, Sayers received administrative support from Gollancz in putting the volumes together, for the first volume, she had to secure copyright permissions herself. And Gollancz's advance to her for doing this work included what he thought she ought to be spending on copyright permissions. So the more she spent on copyrights, the less of her advance she got to keep. Now, I have no idea how typical this is, if this is even a sort of practice that would still be adopted by publishers these days. But you can see it's not a great deal for the editor, really, that, you know, the more they pay out, the less of their advance, you know, payment for their hard work they're actually going to be able to keep. And at times, Sayers was having to almost barter with copyright holders to persuade them to lower their fees for a particular story. I should say that some of the material that I'm drawing on in this part of the paper hasn't been published as far as I'm aware, and it's I'm drawing it from the Gollancz archive, which is at the Modern Record Centre at the University of Warwick. So one example of this bartering, I suppose, in a letter of April 1928, she approached Hughes Massey, the literary agency that represented Agatha Christie, and she asked Hughes Massey to intercede with John Lane, who was Agatha Christie's publisher, because John Lane had quoted a fee of 20 guineas for Sayers to include an Agatha Christie story in that first volume. And Sayers resorted to flattery, explaining, quote, "We have nearly all the first-class people contributing to the volume." So, you know, by implication, Christie is also a first-class author and should be in there. She also mentions that she's writing an introduction for the volume, and she tells the agents that this is a sign that it will be what she calls a collection of real permanent value. So again, this is another reason why Christie might want to be included. Of course, we can see these comments as just sort of tactical, trying to, you know, get what she wants for a bit less money. But it could also indicate a genuine hope on Sayers' part that this book would indeed have some lasting value where the history of the form is concerned, be a lasting reference point for readers. I should say that she eventually, she just wasn't getting anywhere with these negotiations. I think 20 guineas was probably about twice what most authors were asking. I think there were maybe a couple of examples where Sayers actually went as high as 15, but 20 does seem to have been a bit off the scale, really. So there was no Christie story in that first volume, though she did include the Clapham Cook in volume 2. Now, this securing of copyrights was evidently quite a frustrating process for Sayers, as you can probably imagine, but it did at least result in her being able to make some new literary connections, because she wasn't always dealing with authors' agents. Sometimes she was actually dealing with the authors themselves. So one example here is that during the editing of the first volume, she started corresponding with Eustace Barton. He was a doctor who was working at a psychiatric hospital in Northampton, and better known under his pen name Robert Eustace, and you may know that Robert Eustace co-authored a number of stories, often with scientific themes, with both L.T. Mead, the very prolific late 19th, early 20th century author, and also with Edgar Jepson. Jepson and Eustace co-authored the locked room story, The Tea Leaf, first published in 1925, which Sayers included in the first Gollancz volume, and then also again in the Everyman anthology. And as many of you will also know, Eustace co-authored the epistolary novel, The Documents in the Case, published in 1930 with Sayers, and he contributes in particular some of the scientific details around the poisoning by mushrooms that features in the plot of that novel. Although I think Sayers was glad not to have quite so much of an administrative burden when she was editing volumes 2 and 3, that does mean she's slightly more hands-off, really, and doesn't have so many of these direct contacts with authors. There's a letter to Marie Belloc-Lowndes, who was another writer who she first made personal contact with through her editing. So writing to Lowndes when she's working on the second volume, says that this time she's, quote, trying as far as possible to get the authors to suggest themselves which story they would prefer to have included. So this implies that she's maybe not intending to trawl through old material in the way that she had for the first volume. And also perhaps that she was going to be focusing on authors with whom she was at least a little bit familiar. The third volume, as I've mentioned, this one here, draws most heavily on stories that had only previously been published in periodicals. So again, just focusing on the detection half. The Strand provided 10 stories and the Storyteller provided 9 from a total of 27. So that's quite a large proportion, really, of stories from just those 2 periodicals. And all these stories first appeared between 1928 and 1933, so pretty soon before that volume actually appeared. Now, the Strand magazine, still very well-known publication, which, as you may be aware, didn't only publish detective fiction, it published all kinds of genres. The Storyteller, rather more obscure. Sayers' short story Interlude at Scrawns was published in the December 1932 issue, which is the one on the slide, and that story appears as Scrawns in The Teeth of the Evidence, 1939. And as you can see in The Storyteller, it appeared alongside stories by Mrs. Belloc-Lowndes again. She's a little bit of a Selig-like figure in early 20th century literary studies, and other authors who aren't associated with genre fiction at all, really. What The Storyteller had in common, I suppose, with The Strand was precisely this, that it published stories across a variety of genres alongside each other. The Storyteller certainly included little head notes that would give you a bit of a clue as to what type of story you might be about to read. And I suppose in some cases, readers would be familiar with the name of the author. But this perhaps could also shed a little bit of light on that decision that Sayers makes not to really carefully subdivide the contents of Volume 2 and Volume 3 of the Gollancz books. I suppose it kind of, not guiding the reader in that way, maybe invites the reader to consider how capacious detective fiction as a genre might be. So that's the Gollancz volumes. I'm going to move on now and talk about the Everyman anthology and then also Detective Cavalcade. So as with the Oxford World Classics volume, we might be surprised that Everyman decided to publish a detective story anthology. In fact, I was surprised that they published a detective fiction anthology before they'd published a ghost story anthology. Seemed quite striking to me that it was that way around. So Everyman, again, like OUP, carries a certain canonical stamp of approval, I suppose. Detective Cavalcade, that series is appearing in a rather different context in an evening newspaper. And this had an impact logistically. So from Sayers' perspective, the editing of Detective Cavalcade was even more hands-off, I suppose, than for the Gollancz volumes. And it also has an impact in terms of Sayers' own input. as we'll see, she does provide a different kind of what we might call paratextual material for the Detective Cavalcade series. The stuff that appears on the page that isn't actually part of the story. And I'll show you some of that in a minute. So in terms of the process for the Everyman volume, Sayers drew up an initial list of authors. This again was a volume that she was invited to edit, by the way. It wasn't her idea. She was approached to edit it. So she drew up a list, and then the staff at Dent dealt with the copyrights, and Sayers was occasionally consulted if they were running into difficulties, if they wanted her to suggest alternatives, if they were having trouble getting hold of particular material. The scope of the Everyman anthology, quite similar to the first Gollancz anthology, so it includes examples from the Victorian period onwards. I think oh yeah, here we go. So this is the contents page of that Everyman anthology. So we've got there stories of the so-called clue puzzle type, which just have a quick. Yeah, so the tea leaf is here, a bit of a classic of that form, I think. But we've also got stories with a more psychological focus. So the Christie story that's included here, interesting choice for her to include, Philomel Cottage. Rather unusual one. I've written a little bit about that elsewhere. It's a bit of a favourite of mine, actually. But, you know, of all the Christie stories, it's an interesting one to choose to include here. And actually, The Hands of Mr. Ottermole is also a story that, could actually have appeared in the horror section of one of those Gollancz anthologies. As with those Gollancz books, questions of money also came into play here. So John Hatfield, who was the editor at Dent, who was dealing with this, he thought that G.K. Chesterton was too expensive to be included, that the fee being requested was too high. But Sayers absolutely insisted that Chesterton should be included. He actually thought it was more important to include Chesterton than to include Conan Doyle. As you can see, there is no story by Conan Doyle here. But one of the arguments that she uses for including Chesterton is to say that she can't write her introduction to this volume without mentioning him and without talking about him in some detail. So again, that's quite striking because she's seeing that introduction as being quite integral to the volume. She's making an argument for the reader really engaging with that introduction as well as with the contents. I should just mention here that some of the material I'm drawing on in this section is held in the Marion E. Wade Centre at Wheaton College, and I was very much assisted by Laura Schmidt, the archivist there, and also by Hannah Hempstead, who's a postgraduate student there in accessing this material. The other thing just to mention about this is that in order, partly, I think, to make sure they had a substantial enough volume and also to get around some of these issues about money, it was Hatfield who suggested including some older material. So the Wilkie Collins story was his suggestion, for instance, because obviously that was out of copyright, so they weren't having to worry about fees. Sayers' correspondence with Hatfield about this volume indicates that she was really trying to grapple with the challenge of striking a balance between a representative anthology and originality in a market that was increasingly well populated, and not only by the three enormous volumes that she produced for Gollancz. So towards the end of the 1920s, Faber had started producing detective fiction anthologies as well. And in an early letter to Hatfield, the letter that includes her initial list of suggestions, she comments, I'm quoting here, "Many important authors have done all their best work in the long novel and not in the short story form." And she goes on, "Any representative anthology which tries to be original is pretty well bound to be second rate, because the best stories are the ones that have frequently been republished." And she concludes that letter, well, I gather, however, that you would rather have the best stories of the best people, regardless of repetition. So I have worked more or less along those lines. I suppose there's a question underlying all of this of how many anthologies of detective fiction is any one individual likely to buy, unless you're someone like me who would just buy all of them, regardless of what was actually in them. In terms of the readership at the time, is having a well-populated market a good thing or a counterproductive thing? The other thing about those comments is that you get the sense that Sayers is becoming a little bit jaded. That she fears, I suppose, that this Everyman volume might end up being another one that contributes to this repeated reprinting of the same old familiar stories. And Sayers has already, as we've seen, been pretty frank about what she thought the limitations were of the short detective story. And this potential tension between best authors and best stories is also something that shadowed her final anthology project, which is this series, Detective Cavalcade, which she was working on actually at the same time as she was working on the Everyman volume. And like the Everyman volume, Detective Cavalcade does include some examples from the late 19th century, but it has a central focus on contemporary stories. And as I just mentioned earlier, a few authors were persuaded to actually write stories, especially for this series. And the Gladys Mitchell story here was puffed as being the first appearance of Mrs. Bradley in a short story. Again, for this collection, Sayers wasn't required to actually pursue matters of copyright herself. But there was another logistical issue, which doesn't seem to have really arisen so much with the other anthologies she edited, and that was to do with the length of the stories. So the editors at the Standard preferred stories to be about 7,500 words in length, because that meant they could be printed just across 2 pages of the newspaper, including an illustration and Sayers' little introductory note. But in some cases, especially with the longer stories, they did run to as many as 10,000 words. And in that case, they had to go onto an extra page. And that page would almost always not be consecutive with the body of the story. So it would be tucked away towards the back of the newspaper. So I've got a couple of examples to show you. Here's the John Dixon Carr story as it appeared. I realise you're not going to be able to read the text, it's far too small, but just to show you the layout on the page and the other bits of information that were included. So obviously you've got the title of the story, title of the author. We're reminded that this is a story in a series. This is number 14. And the unifying theme, if you like, of this series was that each of the stories featured a notable detective. So we're told that it's Dr. Fell, who is the detective in this case, and Sayers' name also appearing quite prominently. And this section here, that's her introductory blurb. And this series was actually being edited as they went along. So they started publishing the stories, and they were still selecting stories to be published sort of towards the end of July and into August for the series. And Sayers was writing these notes more or less as they went along week by week. And at times she was asked to kind of maybe write a little bit more or a little bit less because of this space issue. The other one that I've got here is this, again, I think this is a rather attractive one. I really like the way the illustrator has kind of brought these cats in down across the 2 pages. It's just a really nice layout, I think. Here's Sayers' note. This one fits into 2 pages, and they even have room for the crossword, which seems somehow appropriate to have that on the same page as a detective story. And in addition to including these little notes on each author and each story, there was also an introductory essay to the whole series that Sayers wrote. You might actually just be able to see that clearly enough to read it, but I don't think I'd ever seen that photograph of Sayers before, which was part of my rationale for sharing that one with you. And the points that she makes here would be familiar if you've read any of Sayers' essays about detective fiction. She does indicate that she sees Detective Cavalcade as being a sort of primer in the form for people who might not be familiar with detective stories. She distinguishes the detective story from the thriller, gives an outline of the so-called rules or conventions. So detective must detect using logic, facts must be reasonable, fair play must be observed, these kinds of things. She also adds some comments that maybe echo both how her own practice as an author had developed by this point, but also her earlier reflections about the difficulty of introducing psychology into the short story. Oh, sorry, I don't have this on a slide, and it's just in these ending comments, concluding comments here. She says, we can, living characters are important. We can reread Conan Doyle again and again for the pleasure of being in the company of Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson. We may forget all the details of an Agatha Christie plot and still joyfully remember the engaging egotisms of Hercule Poirot. Perhaps, after all, it is character that counts. Now, as I've mentioned, the inclusion of a detective was the feature that linked all the stories in this series. So perhaps not so surprising that she emphasizes the importance of character, but it also indicates that an anthology might direct the reader to an author's other work, either in the novel or in the short form, that there was an advantage from authors' perspectives, perhaps, to being included in these sorts of publications, because it might bring them to the attention of new readers. I'm just in this final section, I want to say a little bit about some of the stories that she actually included, because Sayers certainly stayed loyal to particular authors across these 5 collections that she edited. And there were 6 authors who appeared more than once. The first 3 here, probably not really that surprising. I mean, probably not surprising in the context of what I've said already about Sayers' preferences. But even, more generally, not that surprising maybe that these were authors whose work she returned to. I mean, I suppose the surprising omission there is Conan Doyle, but as I've indicated, there were, not only there were financial issues there, as well as questions about Sayers' own preferences, I guess. These last 3, though, Henry Wade, Millward Kennedy, and H.C. Bailey, perhaps a little bit more surprising that they appear so often. I suppose one reason why they tended to be included was that for Sayers, I think, they perhaps represented or exemplified particular approaches to detective fiction. So, for instance, Sayers, talking about Bailey, stresses his interest in what she calls morbid psychology as an interesting aspect of his work. Kennedy and Wade were both interested in developing the technique that R. Austin Freeman was one of the people to initiate, of showing the crime first and the method of detection afterwards. So I think the way that she talks about these authors in her introductions and in those headnotes to their stories in Detective Cavalcade shows her, again, wanting to strike a balance between stories that she deemed influential and stories that demonstrated the ongoing effects of that influence, whilst also introducing innovations of their own. Now, I've mentioned that Sayers wasn't keen on the idea of continually reprinting the same stories. So it's interesting, well, I think it's quite interesting to see which stories appeared in more than one anthology, though, as opposed to which authors, which individual stories she used more than once. The most substantial overlap is between the contents of volume 2 of the Gollancz volumes and the Everyman volume. They included the Croft story, the Knox story, and also the John Rhodes story. And you'll see that the Knox and the Rhodes stories are both from the same year, 1931. These, like H.C. Bentley's story, The Clever Cockatoo, are more or less, well, they're locked room mysteries. And actually, you know, the Tea Leaf kind of falls into that category as well. So Sayers evidently felt that those stories exemplified the efficient and successful use of that form, which retained its popularity despite the growing use or growing introduction of psychology into the short story. I suppose the recurrence of stories that Sayers felt were exemplary of different approaches shows her continuing to want to illustrate these different trajectories that the form had taken. Any Sherlock Holmes stories, one might say, any Sherlock Holmes story, you might say, would do to illustrate Conan Doyle's approach, but only quite a small number of examples would really represent the refinements of the locked room story, for instance. So just to conclude then, by the end of 1936, having edited 5 anthologies over the preceding 8 years, Sayers seems to have had her fill, really. And as I've indicated, even when she's corresponding with Hampton, she's expressing a concern that the public would have had enough, and that some stories that from one point of view would be considered classics, from another perspective could just seem hackneyed. But despite this apparent disillusionment, I think Sayers' anthologies do continue to serve their dual purpose. They offer us what would still be considered, I think, you know, important examples, landmarks of the form, whilst reminding us of the enormous, still relatively unmapped hinterland of short fiction from the 1920s and 30s that is now, through the reprinting of anthologies, but also through the compilation of new ones, being made available again for readers to explore. Thank you very much.